What happens when SCP-049, the mysterious plague doctor, enters the grim darkness of the Warhammer 40K universe? In a galaxy where disease, corruption, chaos, and death are part of everyday life, SCP-049 believes he has discovered the greatest manifestation of the pestilence he has ever encountered. Surrounded by poxwalkers, Nurgle's corruption, and billions of suffering souls, the Doctor sees not monsters, but patients desperately in need of a cure. But his methods are unlike anything the Imperium has ever seen. With a single touch, he can silence infected creatures and transform them into strange, obedient beings. When the Inquisition discovers what he is capable of, they are faced with an impossible decision. Should they destroy this mysterious entity as a threat to humanity, or use his abilities against the forces of chaos? And as SCP-049 begins to explore a galaxy filled with endless disease and war, one terrifying truth becomes clear. The Doctor has never had this many patients before, and his work has only just begun. So, sit tight, get comfortable, and let's get into the story. The galaxy did not scream when the Doctor arrived. It merely gasped, a rattling, wet sound, like a cosmic patient drowning in its own lungs. In the grim darkness of the far future, the warp is a churning ocean of madness. But for SCP-049, the transition was not a journey through a hellscape. It was a sudden clinical shift in the quality of the air. He stepped out of a collapsing reality fold within a containment cell at Site-19 and found himself standing in the subspires of Ocularis Prime, a hive world in the Segmentum Pacificus. The atmosphere here was thick with the copper tang of blood, the sulfurous exhaust of miles-high factorums, and, most prominently, the overwhelming screeching vibrato of the Pestilence. On Earth, the great Pestilence had been a whisper, a subtle rot he hunted with surgical precision. Here, in the 41st millennium, the Pestilence was a roar. It was written in the very molecules of the smog and the souls of the billions huddling in the dark. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. SCP-049 stood perfectly still, his heavy, dark robes settling around his boots. His mask, the bird-like visage that was as much a part of his face as skin, tilted upward, scanning the vaulted Gothic architecture of the hive's lower depths. Above him, gargoyles wept industrial runoff. Below him, the metal floor grumbled with the vibrations of distant, heavy machinery. He adjusted his leather gloves and gripped the handle of his black medical bag. He was not afraid. To the Doctor, fear was merely a symptom of a mind not yet cured. He sensed life nearby. Shuffling. Diseased life. The first inhabitants of this new world to encounter the Doctor were not men, but what remained of them. A pack of poxwalkers, victims of the gifts of Nurgle, shambled out from the shadows of a rusted promethium tank. Their skin was a bruised green, bloated with gases, and weeping with sores that shouldn't have allowed for movement. They laughed a wet, gurgling laugh, their mindless devotion to the plague god, driving them toward the scent of fresh meat. To an Imperial guardsman, these were horrors to be purged with fire. To SCP-049, they were a professional insult. "Oh my," the Doctor murmured, his voice a calm, melodic baritone that echoed strangely against the rusted iron walls. "The infection here is advanced, highly irregular. I have never seen a strain so aggressive, so utterly lackadaisical in its structural integrity." As the first poxwalker lunged, its jaw hanging by a single tendon, 049 did not flinch. He simply reached out a gloved hand and tapped the creature on its forehead. The effect was instantaneous. The warp-fueled vitality that animated the corpse vanished. The poxwalker didn't just die. Its biological functions underwent a total, absolute cessation. It collapsed into a heap of truly dead meat, the unnatural heat of the chaos rot snuffed out by a touch that brooked no argument from the laws of nature. The other creatures paused, their dim, maggot-filled brains sensing a predator that didn't hunt for food, but for purity. "Do not worry," 049 said, opening his bag with practiced ease. "I am a doctor. I am here to provide the cure." For the next 3 hours, the lower sublevels of Hive Ocularis became a theater of anomalous surgery. 049 worked with a speed that defied human observation, his scalpels and bone saws flashing in the dim amber light of flickering lumen globes. He did not mind the filth. His own body was an island of sterile intent in a sea of decay. He drained the demonic humors, replaced ruined organs with synthesized equivalents from his bag, and stitched flesh with a silver thread that hummed with a low, stabilizing frequency. One by one, the poxwalkers were transformed. They were no longer the weeping, laughing thralls of Nurgle. They were something else. SCP-049-2 instances. They stood up, their skin now a pale, waxy gray, their eyes vacant and devoid of the chaotic spark. They were silent. They were obedient. They were cured. It was this scene that greeted Interrogator Coles of the Ordo Sepulturum when he led a squad of stormtroopers into the sector to investigate the sudden silencing of the local outbreak. Coles had expected to find a charnel house or a rising tide of filth. Instead, he found a vaulted chamber that smelled of sharp vinegar and powerful disinfectants. In the center of the room stood a figure in archaic, crow-like garb, surrounded by 20 pale, silent figures who stood in a perfect, eerie formation. "Halt in the name of the Holy Inquisition," Coles shouted, his bolt pistol leveled at the doctor's chest. The stormtroopers fanned out, their hellguns humming as their laser sights danced across 049's mask. "Identify yourself, mutant. Are you a herald of the ruinous powers?" 049 turned slowly, his movements graceful and devoid of hostility. He looked at the interrogator, and for a moment, Coles felt a cold shiver run down his spine, a sensation that he was being weighed, measured, and diagnosed. "Mutant? No," the doctor replied, his voice filled with a gentle, scholarly disappointment. "I am a physician. And you? Oh, you are suffering quite severely. I can see the shadows of it in your marrow. The pestilence has a firm grip on your species, does it not? It is a wonder you can even stand." "Don't listen to its lies," a stormtrooper barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's a sorcerer. Look at what it's done to the heretics." Coles looked at the silent gray figures. They weren't attacking. They weren't chanting. They were simply waiting. He had spent years hunting the undead of Nurgle, and he knew their stench. This was different. This was the smell of a morgue, not a swamp. "Lower your weapons," Coles commanded, his voice trembling slightly. He was a man of the Inquisition, trained to see the hidden threat, but he was also a man of desperate pragmatism. The hive was falling. The great rift had bled madness into the skies. If this creature could silence the pox, it was either the greatest threat they had ever faced, or a miracle sent from the Golden Throne. "You say you have a cure?" Coles asked, stepping forward. 049 tilted his head, a gesture of genuine interest. "I have the cure, Master Coles, though I suspect your definition of the word and mine may differ. Your world is very sick. The air itself is a vector, but I am here now. My work has truly begun," the doctor gestured to his silent attendants. The stormtroopers flinched as the 0492 instances stepped forward, not to strike, but to offer the interrogator a discarded, purified pendant of the Imperial Aquila they had found in the muck. "You are fortunate," 049 added, his eyes burning with a cold, focused light behind his mask. "I have never had a laboratory of this scale before. So many patients, so much work to be done." Coles looked from the doctor to the pale, cured monsters, and then up toward the spire, where billions more waited in fear. He knew he should execute the entity. He knew that to consort with the Xeno or the unknown was heresy. But he also knew that Ocularis Prime was dying, and for the first time in 10,000 years, something had arrived that didn't want to eat humanity or corrupt it. It simply wanted to operate. "Doctor," Coles said, his voice hardening with a terrible resolve. "Come with me. My master, Inquisitor Vane, will wish to see your handiwork." "Excellent," 049 replied, stowing a blood-stained saw back into his bag. "I shall require a great deal more thread." The journey from the lightless sumps of the hive's underbelly to the stratospheric heights of the inquisitorial spire was a descent into a different kind of madness. SCP-049 sat motionless in the back of an Arvis lighter, his hands folded neatly over his medical bag. Beside him sat Interrogator Coles, whose hand never strayed far from his bolt pistol, and across from them stood 4 of the doctor's cured subjects. They were strapped into crash harnesses, their gray, waxy faces staring blankly at the vibrating metal hull. To the stormtroopers flanking the hold, these creatures were an abomination, yet they lacked the chaotic twitching and the weeping sores of the poxwalkers they had been hours before. They were silent, sterile, and eerily still. 049 looked through the reinforced viewport of the shuttle. Below him, the hive city of Ocularis Prime stretched out like a cancerous growth of iron and stone, miles deep and hundreds of miles wide. He saw the glowing veins of the promethium lines and the toxic clouds that hugged the mid-spires like a suffocating shroud. His bird-like mask tilted as he observed the sheer scale of the habitation blocks. On his world, a city of 20 million was a crisis. Here, a single hive held billions, and he could feel the pestilence radiating from every level. It was a cacophony of biological distress, a symphony of decay that made his very marrow ache with the need to intervene. Your species is remarkably efficient at creating environments for the great pestilence to thrive, 049 remarked, his voice cutting through the roar of the shuttle's engines. Such density, such lack of hygiene. It is as if you are intentionally breeding the very thing I have spent lifetimes trying to eradicate. We do what we must to serve the Emperor, Coles replied, his voice strained. The hive provides the tithe provides the armies keep the darkness at bay. And yet, 049 countered softly, the darkness is already inside. I can smell it on you, interrogator. A lingering malaise, not the rot of the monsters below, but a thinning of the spirit, a precursor to the physical breakdown. Coles did not answer. He couldn't. He had spent his life fighting the heretic and the Xeno, but this creature spoke of his soul as if it were a lung filled with fluid. The shuttle docked in the sanctum of the Silvered Blade, an inquisitorial fortress monastery perched on the highest spire, where the air was thin and scrubbed of pollutants by massive atmospheric processors. As the ramp lowered, 049 stepped out into a hall of white marble and black obsidian. Servo skulls buzzed through the air like metallic insects, their parchment streamers fluttering in the artificial breeze. At the end of the hall stood Inquisitor Vane of the Ordo Sepulturum. Vane was a man who looked as though he had been carved from cold flint. His left side was almost entirely mechanical, a silvered bionic eye that whirred as it focused, and a master-crafted power fist that crackled with blue energy. He wore robes of deep crimson and gold, and around his neck hung the rosette of the Inquisition, the ultimate symbol of imperial authority. He watched the doctor approach with a gaze that had condemned entire solar systems to death. Interrogator Coles tells me you are a miracle worker, Vane said, his voice a gravelly rasp, or a very talented heretic. On Ocularis, those two things are often the same. 049 bowed, a slow, courtly gesture that felt centuries out of place in the Gothic industrialism of the 41st millennium. I am neither, Lord Inquisitor. I am a man of science. I have observed a profound lack of medical discipline in this sector, and I have taken it upon myself to begin the necessary treatments. Vane gestured toward the gray-skinned thralls following 049. You call those treatments? They are dead. I can see it with my augmetic. Their hearts do not beat. Their lungs do not draw breath. And yet, they move at your command. They are cured, 049 insisted, his voice sharpening with a hint of professional indignation. The pestilence required a total systemic overhaul. They are no longer capable of transmitting the infection, nor are they susceptible to the whispers of the entities you seem so afraid of. Is that not the goal of your Inquisition? To stop the rot? Vane walked a slow circle around one of the 0492 instances. He drew a combat blade and ran it across the creature's arm. No blood flowed. The skin was cold and leathery. The creature did not flinch, did not growl, did not even blink. It simply stood, waiting for its master's word. The pox of Nurgle, Vane whispered, his bionic eye clicking. It is a corruption of the soul as much as the flesh. It turns men into laughing, weeping vectors of filth. My Ordo spends centuries trying to find a way to halt the spread without burning the world to cinders. And you did this in an afternoon? It is a simple procedure once the variables are understood, 049 said, opening his bag and producing a long, wicked-looking needle filled with a translucent blue fluid. Though I admit, the variables in this reality are louder. The pestilence here has a voice. It screams from the very air. It is called the warp, Doctor, Vane said, turning back to him. And it is the source of every nightmare that haunts humanity. If you truly have the power to sever its connection to the flesh, you are the most valuable asset in the segmentum, or the most dangerous. I need a demonstration. Vane signaled to a pair of armored guards. They dragged a heavy, reinforced cage into the hall. Inside was a man in the tattered remnants of a cultist's rags. He was in the mid-stages of Nurgle's rot. His belly was distended, his eyes were clouded with milky cataracts, and he was humming a low, dissonant tune that seemed to make the very shadows in the room vibrate. The smell of decay was so potent that the stormtroopers adjusted their rebreathers. "Cure him," Vane commanded. "Show me the price of your mercy." 049 approached the cage. He did not seem bothered by the stench or the humming. He looked at the cultist with a profound, almost fatherly pity. Such a tragedy. To be left in this state for so long. The inefficiency of your local hospitalers is truly staggering. He reached through the bars. The cultist lunged, baring teeth that were rotting into jagged points. 049 didn't flinch. He simply placed a single finger on the cultist's cheek. The change was violent. The cultist's humming stopped instantly. His body went rigid, his eyes flying wide as every biological process within him simply ceased. It was as if a candle had been snuffed out by a hurricane. The man collapsed, hitting the floor of the cage with a heavy, final thud. To the onlookers, it looked like murder. To 049, it was the first step. "The patient is stabilized," 049 announced. "The invasive spirit has been evicted. Now, the reconstructive work begins. Lord Inquisitor, I shall require a sterile environment and a lack of interruptions. This strain is quite complex, and I wish to be thorough." Vane watched the dead man in the cage. He had seen thousands die of the rot, their bodies melting into sludge even as they screamed praises to the plague god. But this death was clean. It was absolute. The warp taint that had been radiating from the cultist was gone, replaced by a void. "Give him whatever he requires," Vane said to Coles, "and double the guard. If he fails, kill him. If he succeeds, then we have found a way to fight the plague god that doesn't involve exterminatus." 049 was led to a high-spire laboratory, a place of cold steel and flickering hollows. As he unpacked his tools, laying out scalpels that caught the dying light of the ocularis sun, he looked out at the billions of souls below. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in centuries. On Earth, he had been a prisoner, a curiosity. Here, he was a general in an eternal war against the only enemy that mattered. "So many patients," he whispered, his reflection in the glass showing a crow-masked shadow. "So little time, but we shall begin with the heart. Always the heart." He turned to the dead cultist on the table and picked up a bone saw. The work was glorious. The work was all. The procedure on the cultist lasted precisely 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 22 seconds. Throughout the entire process, SCP-049 moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace that even the most experienced chirurgeons of the Adeptus Mechanicus would have found unnerving. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. He did not use the heavy, blunt instruments of the Imperium, the whirring nartheciums or the crude cautery irons. Instead, his gloved hands danced through the air, wielding scalpels that seemed to shimmer with an internal, sterile light. When he finally stepped back, wiping a speck of black, congealed ichor from his cuff, the creature on the slab was no longer a man, nor was it a monster. It was a masterpiece of stasis. The former cultist stood up. The distended belly had been sliced open, reorganized, and stitched shut with silver wire in a pattern that looked more like an occult circuit than a medical suture. The milky cataracts were gone, replaced by a dull, uniform gray. The creature did not breathe. It did not pulse, with the frantic, wet energy of the warp. It simply stood, its head bowed in a posture of eternal servitude to the doctor. Inquisitor Vane watched through the reinforced armor glass of the observation deck, his bionic eye clicking rapidly as it recorded the data. Beside him, Magos Biologus Hvark of the Adeptus Mechanicus hissed through a vox grill, his many-jointed mechadendrites twitching in a frenzy of binary calculation. "Biological cessation confirmed," the Magos droned, the sound like grinding gears. "And yet, locomotive function remains. It is not a servitor. There are no lobotomy circuits, no cybernetic overrides. The subject's cellular structure has been rewritten. It is an affront to the machine god. It is biological heresy." "It is a weapon," Vane countered, his voice low and dangerous. "Magos, we have seen the plague of the despoiler sweep through entire subsectors. We have seen worlds lost not to guns, but to a cough and a fever. This creature, this doctor, has just demonstrated the ability to strip the warp taint from a living host and replace it with absolute, unyielding obedience. If he can do this to one, he can do it to an army. 049 looked up at the observation window, his mask reflecting the harsh lumen glare. He didn't speak, but Vane felt the weight of that gaze. It wasn't the look of a subject, it was the look of a superior assessing a junior colleague. The door to the laboratory hissed open, and Vane stepped inside, flanked by a squad of Grey Knight purifiers, warriors whose very presence was a psychic anathema to the warp. Their silver armor hummed with sanctified energy, their halberds crackling with white fire. Even they paused as they entered the room, sensing the strange, hollow vacuum that SCP-049 projected. He was not a daemon, nor was he a psyker. To their heightened senses, he felt like a hole in the universe, a clean, surgical puncture in the fabric of reality. "Your procedure is successful," Vane said, stopping 10 paces from the doctor. "The subject is stable. He is cured," 049 corrected gently. "The pestilence was deep in his marrow, Lord Inquisitor. It took quite a bit of effort to excise the metaphysical roots. Your warp is a very persistent pathogen. It clings to the soul like a parasite, feeding on the host's vitality to manifest its own grotesque symptoms. The warp is the foundation of our nightmare," Vane said, "and you have just proven you can sever its grip. Therefore, by the authority of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, I am declaring you a sanctioned asset of the Ordo Sepulchrum. You will be given resources. You will be given subjects. In exchange, you will serve the Imperium. You will be our surgeon in the dark." 049 tilted his head. "Service? I have no interest in your politics or your Imperium. My only concern is the great pestilence. However, I see that your organization possesses a truly magnificent quantity of infected individuals. If your service entails providing me with the means to continue my research on a galactic scale, then I find the arrangement acceptable. There is a condition," Vane added, gesturing to the Grey Knights. "You will be monitored at all times. If you attempt to cure anyone not designated for treatment, if you touch an Imperial officer or a holy servant without permission, you will be vaporized. Your bag will be confiscated, and your memory erased from the stars." The doctor let out a soft, dry chuckle. "The threats of the sick are so often melodramatic. Very well. Where shall we begin? I find the air in this hive to be particularly stagnant. I believe a field test is in order." The field test took place 48 hours later in the quarantined ruins of Hive Tertium. The district had been overrun by the gifts of the Fly King, a virulent strain of Nurgle's rot that turned the living into weeping heaps of sludge while their spirits were dragged into the Garden of Decay. A localized warp rift had opened in a grand cathedral, and the air was thick with the droning of a billion flies. Imperial Guard units had been held back, the High Command unwilling to lose more men to the contagion. Instead, Vane deployed his new asset. 049 stepped off the Valkyrie ramp into a literal hellscape. The ground was slick with black bile. The walls of the cathedral were pulsating with unnatural growths. From the shadows, a great unclean one, a mountain of rotting fat and exposed entrails, bellowed a laugh that sounded like a wet landslide. Lesser demons, plague-bearers with single weeping eyes, shuffled forward, counting the number of sores on their bodies in a rhythmic droning chant. The doctor did not draw a weapon. He simply walked toward them, his black robes fluttering in the putrid wind. Behind him followed a dozen of his 0492 instances, the cured cultists from the lab, now clad in reinforced flak armor and carrying surgical stakes. A plague-bearer lunged, its rusted plague sword dripping with a toxin that could melt ceramite. 049 didn't dodge. He caught the blade with his bare, gloved hand. The metal did not corrode. The warp toxin did not infect him. Instead, the moment his fingers touched the daemon's weapon, the rusted iron turned to cold, sterile ash. He reached out with his other hand and grasped the plague-bearer's throat. The daemon didn't just die, it vanished. The warp energy that sustained its form was snuffed out by the doctor's touch. The pestilence, that was the daemon's very existence, was neutralized. It was as if 049's hand was a physical manifestation of the Emperor's own light, but cold, clinical, and devoid of faith. "So many symptoms," 049 murmured, stepping over the pile of ash. "So much wasted energy. You are not life. You are a fever dream of a dying universe." The great unclean one roared, swinging a massive rusted flail. 049 ducked beneath the blow with a speed that blurred the senses. He climbed the daemon's rotting leg, his touch turning sections of its putrid flesh into gray, inert stone. The daemon screamed, a sound of genuine existential terror. It was used to fire, to swords, to psychic bolts. It was not used to being erased. Be still, 049 whispered, as he reached the daemon's chest. The surgery will be extensive, but I promise, you will feel nothing when the end comes. From the observation post, Vane watched through magnoculars. He saw the massive daemon begin to crumble, not from damage, but from a total loss of metaphysical cohesion. 049 was working his way toward the heart of the rift, his presence alone causing the flies to drop dead from the air in sterile heaps. The Emperor preserve us, Coles whispered, crossing himself. He's not killing them. He's unmaking the disease. He is the perfect weapon, Vane said, his voice trembling with a dark ambition. But look at his eyes, Coles. He doesn't see a war. He sees a hospital, and I fear what happens when he decides the entire Imperium is his next patient. In the center of the cathedral, SCP-049 stood amidst the dissolving remains of a demon prince, his hands stained with the gray dust of neutralized chaos. He looked at the warp rift, a jagged tear in reality that bled purple and green light. A fascinating wound, the doctor said to himself. I shall need a much larger needle. The Vengeance of St. Capelline was not a ship so much as a Gothic cathedral of iron, 30 miles long and hollowed out to serve as a floating tomb for the damned. It was a black ship of the Inquisition, a vessel designed to transport the Psyker's tithe across the lightless voids toward Holy Terra. Within its cold, labyrinthine corridors, the air was perpetually thick with the scent of sacred incense, the metallic tang of null circuitry, and the low, psychic static of thousands of screaming minds held in telepathic stasis. For SCP-049, being relocated to this vessel was like being moved from a local clinic into the heart of a planetary plague ward. The doctor sat in a specialized containment cell in the ship's midsection, though containment was a generous term. The walls were lined with hexagrammic wards and psychic dampeners, meant to contain the warp active, but they did little to hinder 049. He spent his hours pacing the small, sterile room, his leather boots clicking softly against the deck plating. Inquisitor Vane had granted him access to his medical bag and a rotation of unstable psyker subjects, men and women whose minds were fracturing under the weight of the warp. To the Inquisition, these were dangerous ticking bombs or fuel for the Golden Throne. To 049, they were the most fascinating patients he had ever encountered. The resonance, 049 whispered, pressing his gloved hand against the vibrating bulkhead of his cell. It is not just in the blood. It is in the frequency of the soul. He looked at the subject currently strapped to his operating table, a young woman, barely 20, who had been found on a frontier world exhibiting the ability to boil water with her thoughts. Now, she was a vessel for something far worse. Her eyes were rolled back, showing only white, and her skin was translucent, with purple veins that seemed to pulse in time with the ship's engines. To the doctor's sight, she was shrouded in a thick, oily mist, the Pestilence, in its purest, most aggressive form. You see, 049 said, addressing the servo skull that hovered in the corner, recording his every move for Vane's archives. On my previous world, the infection was subtle. It was a degradation of the biological imperative. But here the Pestilence is an intruder from another dimension. It is a spiritual rot that masquerades as evolution. He picked up a long, silver needle, its tip glowing with a faint, blue phosphorescence. This was a new chemical he had synthesized from the spinal fluid of the cured poxwalkers and the rare anti-psychic salts provided by the Inquisition. He called it the anchor. Be still, child, he murmured to the twitching girl. The noise will stop soon. As he inserted the needle into the base of her skull, the girl's body arched violently. A sound that was not a human scream, but a discordant psychic blast, erupted from her throat. The lights in the cell flickered and died, replaced by the emergency red glow of the ship's internal alarms. Outside in the corridors, the Sisters of Silence, null maidens who possessed no soul and dampened the warp by their mere presence, tightened their grip on their executioner blades. They felt a sudden, sharp coldness emanating from the doctor's cell, a sensation that even their void-like natures found strange. 049 did not flinch as the psychic energy lashed out at him. To him, the warp fire was merely the frantic thrashing of a dying germ. He held the needle steady until the girl's body slumped back onto the table. The purple veins faded. The oily mist evaporated. The girl did not die. Not yet. Her heart slowed to a glacial pace, 1 beat every minute. Her brain activity flattened into a state of total, dreamless equilibrium. Clinical stasis achieved, 049 noted, his voice calm in the crimson dark. The warp parasite has been severed from the neural network. The patient is no longer a conductor for the noise. The door to the cell hissed open, and Interrogator Coles entered, flanked by 2 Sisters of Silence. The sisters moved with a predatory grace, their gold and crimson armor reflecting the emergency lights. They looked at 049 with an expression of deep, unsettling suspicion. To them, he was an anomaly they could not categorize. He had no psychic signature, yet he was not a blank like them. He was something else, a biological certainty in a universe of fluid horror. The Inquisitor wants an update, Doctor, Coles said, his hand hovering over his holster. The ship's astropaths are complaining of a void spot in the mid-decks. They say you're erasing things. I am curing them, Interrogator, 049 replied, wiping the needle clean with a piece of sterile gauze. Your psychers are not gifted. They are infected. They are portals for a cosmic malignancy that seeks to unravel all structural order. I have simply found a way to seal the portal without destroying the house. He gestured to the girl on the table. One of the Sisters of Silence stepped forward, placing a hand on the girl's forehead. The sister's eyes widened slightly. Usually, touching a psyker felt like touching a hot stove or a nest of vipers. This girl felt like stone. Cold, inert stone. There was no trace of the warp left in her. She was a biological human, but the spark that allowed the warp to find her had been surgically removed. She is empty, Coles whispered, reading the sister's hand signals. You've made her into an untouchable? No, 049 said, shaking his head. An untouchable is a natural vacuum. This patient is merely neutral. She is no longer part of the conversation. I have diagnosed the root of your chaos, Master Coles. It is not a god nor a set of powers. It is a systemic failure of reality to maintain its own borders. The pestilence I have hunted for centuries is merely the shadow cast by your warp. And now that I understand the source, I realize my work has barely begun. Coles felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What do you mean? The great pestilence is the warp itself, 049 stated, his voice taking on a chillingly messianic tone. Every soul in this galaxy is a vector for it. Every world is a breeding ground. I used to think I could cure a city, a country, perhaps a planet. But now I see the scale of the task. The entire materium is in the grip of a terminal illness, and you, the Inquisition, are merely treating the symptoms with fire and prayer. He turned back to his medical bag, his movements purposeful and terrifying. I shall need more subjects, particularly those you call space marines. Their physiology is robust. It could withstand the more aggressive surgical techniques required for a permanent cure. You want to operate on the Emperor's angels? Coles hissed. That's blasphemy. That's treason of the highest order. Is it? 049 asked, tilting his mask. Your angels are the most heavily modified organisms in the galaxy, yet even they fall to the rot. I have seen the records of the Death Guard. They are the ultimate manifestation of my failure as a physician. They are a disease that has learned to walk. To stop them, I must understand the limits of the Astartes frame. Suddenly, the ship groaned. A massive impact rocked the vengeance of St. Capelline, throwing Coles against the bulkhead. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the hull, followed by the frantic, wet tolling of a bell. A bell that sounded like it was being rung from inside a liquid lung. The Geller Field! Coles screamed into his Vox link. Report! What hit us? 7 hits, Interrogator! The Vox crackled with static and the sound of wet, tearing flesh. The Geller Field didn't fail. It was bypassed. Something is boarding us from the Empyrean. It smells like a swamp. 049 stood perfectly still amidst the chaos, his eyes brightening. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a surgeon who had just been handed a particularly difficult but rewarding case. The Death Guard, 049 murmured, his voice filled with a terrible anticipation. The great pestilence has come to meet me. How very proactive of it. He reached into his bag and pulled out a pair of long, serrated bone saws. Interrogator, I suggest you stay behind me. The patients arriving are in desperate need of a very final consultation. End quote. As the bulkheads at the end of the hall began to bubble and rust away into black sludge, SCP-049 stepped forward, his black robes billowing in the sudden, foul-smelling wind. The surgeon was ready. The bulkhead did not simply break, it surrendered. The reinforced adamantium, inscribed with enough hexagrammic wards to protect a subsector capital, curdled like spoiled milk. It softened, turned to a weeping, rust-colored sludge, and Sepis sloughed away to reveal the nightmare on the other side. Through the dissolving metal stepped the Plague Marines of the Death Guard, warriors of the 14th Legion who had long ago traded their humanity for the eternal, rotting embrace of Nurgle. They were giants of corroded ceramite, their armor leaking black bile and teeming with translucent, fat-bodied maggots. One carried a heavy flail of skulls that dripped a liquid so toxic it hissed as it touched the deck plating. Another, a tallyman of Nurgle, clutched a parchment of human skin, scribbling the names of the soon-to-be dead with a quill made from a sharpened femur. Interrogator Coles stumbled back, his bolt pistol barking 3 times. The explosive rounds buried themselves in the lead Marine's chest, detonating in a spray of grayish gore and rusted shrapnel. The Marine didn't even flinch. He merely let out a wet, rattling chuckle that sounded like a swamp exhaling. "The grandfather sends his regards," the Marine wheezed, his vox grill choked with filth. "He has heard of a new doctor in the galaxy. He wishes to compare notes." SCP-049 stepped past Coles, his movement so smooth it seemed to ignore the violent tilting of the ship. He did not raise a weapon. He did not chant a prayer. He simply stared at the towering abomination with an expression of profound, professional disgust. "You," the doctor said, his voice echoing with a crystalline clarity that seemed to push back the buzzing of the flies. "You are the most egregious violation of biological law I have ever had the misfortune to witness. You are not a patient. You are a walking oncology ward, a total systemic failure sustained by sheer, stubborn entropy." The Death Guard Marine swung his rusted power scythe, moved with a blurring, predatory speed, his black robes whipping through the air like the wings of a scavenger bird. He ducked beneath the sweep of the blade and lunged forward, pressing his gloved palm against the Marine's midsection, right where the ceramite had cracked, to reveal a pulsating, green-veined mass of intestines. The effect was not a wound, it was a vacuum. The unnatural, warp-fueled vitality that kept the Marine's rotting body moving was suddenly, violently extinguished. The maggots inside his armor turned to gray ash instantly. The liquid rot in his veins froze, then vanished into a sterile nothingness. The Marine's laughter died in his throat. For the first time in 10,000 years, the warrior of Nurgle felt cold. He felt dead. He collapsed, his massive armor hitting the floor with a hollow, metallic clang that signaled the departure of the warp spirit that had inhabited it. The other Plague Marines paused, their single, fly-like eyes narrowing. They were used to being shot, burned, and blasted by psychic lightning. They were not used to being deleted. "Impossible!" the tallyman hissed, his quill snapping in his grip. "The grandfather's gifts are eternal." "Your grandfather is a butcher who has forgotten the basic principles of hygiene," 049 replied, reaching into his bag and pulling out a handful of silver-throwing scalpels. "And I am a very thorough surgeon." Before the Death Guard could respond, the corridor behind Coles exploded in a flash of blue light and the roar of bolter fire. "For the Emperor, suffer not the unclean to live." A squad of Deathwatch Space Marines, the elite alien hunters of the Imperium, charged into the breach. These were the best of the best, drawn from a dozen different chapters, their black armor polished to a mirror sheen. At their head was Watch Captain Vale of the Ultramarines, his power sword wreathed in white lightning. They saw the Death Guard and opened fire with a disciplined ferocity, the heavy thud-thud-thud of bolters filling the narrow hall. "Inquisitorial asset! Move aside!" Vale roared, his helm's targeting reticle locking onto the remaining Plague Marines. But 049 did not move aside. He moved into the crossfire. To the horror of the Death Watch, the Doctor began weaving through the battlefield, his touch bringing a silent, absolute death to any Plague Marine he could reach. He was a shadow among giants. When a Death Watch brother, a Black Templar named Arnulf, was struck in the shoulder by a Plague Cleaver, he fell to one knee, his armor hissing as the warp toxin began to eat through his skin. "Brother Arnulf, fall back!" Vale shouted. but the toxin was too fast. Arnulf's face was already turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow, his veins blackening. "Do not move," a calm voice said. 049 was suddenly there, kneeling beside the fallen giant. "Back, Xeno thing," Arnulf spat, trying to raise his chainsword, but his muscles were already liquefying. "I am not a Xeno, and I am certainly not a thing," 049 said, his voice as soothing as a funeral dirge. "I am the only one here who can stop the necrotic cascade. Your angels are robust, but even they cannot fight a pathogen that rewrites the soul." With a speed that bypassed the Marine's instinctive defenses, 049 plunged a needle into Arnulf's neck. It was the anchor serum, but a concentrated dose designed for Astartes' physiology. The Black Templar's body spasmed. His eyes rolled back. The yellow tint faded from his skin, replaced by a deathly, waxy pallor. "What are you doing to him?" Vale screamed, leveled his bolt rifle at the doctor's head. "Get away from him, or I'll blow your mask through your skull." "I am saving his life," 049 said, standing up as the remaining Death Guard were finally cut down by the rest of the squad. Though, as I told your Inquisitor, the definition of life is subject to clinical interpretation. Arnulf stood up. He did not pick up his bolter. He did not shout a battle cry. He stood perfectly still, his eyes blank and gray. The massive hole in his shoulder, where the plague cleaver had struck, was no longer weeping. It had been cauterized and filled with a strange, translucent substance that hummed with a low frequency. "Brother Arnulf?" Vale whispered, stepping closer. The Black Templar turned his head slowly. He looked at his captain, but there was no recognition, no fire of the Crusader. "The Pestilence is gone," Arnulf droned, his voice a flat, mechanical monotone. "The doctor is correct." The Deathwatch Marines recoiled in unison. They had seen brothers fall to chaos. They had seen them mutated by Xenos, and they had seen them entombed in dreadnoughts. But they had never seen a Space Marine turned into a silent, hollowed-out puppet. "You've turned him into a servitor," Vale hissed, his power sword crackling with a lethal intent. "You've stolen his soul." "I have removed the vector of his suffering," 049 countered, his voice cold. "He was dying. Now, he is immune. He is the first of a new breed, Captain. An angel who cannot fall, because he no longer possesses the weakness of spirit that the warp exploits." 049 looked around the corridor, at the piles of cured Death Guard, and the horrified elite of the Imperium. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The Death Watch were magnificent specimens, strong, fast, and disciplined. If he could cure the entire Adeptus Astartes, the Great Pestilence would have no more champions. The war would end not with a bang, but with a silent, sterile click of a scalpel. "Lord Vane will be pleased," 049 said, stowing his needle. "We have proven that even the Emperor's finest can be optimized." Vale looked at the empty shell that had been his brother-in-arms, then at the crow-masked figure who stood amidst the carnage like a priest of a dead god. He realized then that the Inquisition hadn't found a weapon against chaos. They had found something that was, in its own sterile way, just as terrifying. "We are leaving," Vale said, his voice trembling with a suppressed rage. "And you, Doctor, you stay away from my men. If I see you touch another brother, I won't wait for Vane's permission to end you." "Of course," 049 replied, bowing slightly. "But remember, Captain, the Pestilence does not wait for permission. And when it comes for you, you will find that I am the only one who does not fear the dark." Deep within the eye of a localized warp storm, where the laws of physics are replaced by the whim of the plague god, the flagship Endurance hung in the void like a rotting whale. This was the seat of the Death Guard, a fortress of iron and filth that served the will of Mortarion, the daemon Primarch of Nurgle. Inside its humid, slime-slicked halls, the atmosphere was a literal soup of pathogens, diseases that could liquefy bone and viruses that possessed a cruel, laughing sentience. In a chamber filled with the rhythmic, wet thumping of 1,000 giant transplanted hearts, a plague surgeon named Golgoth the Untidy hunched over a brass scrying pool. He was a creature of immense bulk, his armor fused to his fat, bloated flesh, his many surgical arms ending in rusted needles and serrated blades. He was not looking at the future, but at a memory, a psychic echo harvested from the dying mind of the tallyman who had boarded the vengeance of Saint Capelline. The scrying pool rippled, showing a crow-masked figure touching a plague marine. Golgoth watched as the blessings of Nurgle were not defeated but simply extinguished, the maggots turning to ash, the rot turning to gray stone, the joyous, buzzing life of the garden replaced by a cold, sterile silence. Golgoth let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the jars of preserved humors on his workbench. "This is not death," he wheezed, the sound like gravel in a blender. "Death is part of the cycle. Death leads to decay, and decay leads to new, glorious life. This is the void. This is a denial of the grandfather's love." "It is a blasphemy of silence," a voice answered, colder and more resonant than the surgeon's. Golgoth bowed, as low as his distended belly would allow. From the shadows stepped a figure of terrifying majesty. Mortarion, the Pale King, stood nearly 20 feet tall. His wings, moth-like and tattered, draped behind him like a funeral shroud. His face was a pale, gaunt mask of bitterness, and he leaned heavily on silence, a scythe that had reaped the souls of kings and gods alike. Around him, the air grew so thick with toxins that even Golgoth had to engage his auxiliary filters. "My sons are being cured, Golgoth," Mortarion whispered, his voice a dry rasp that carried the weight of 10,000 years of spite. I felt the connection sever. A strand of the grandfather's tapestry was simply cut, not burned, not broken, snipped away as if by a tailor. "The creature calls itself a doctor, my lord," Golgoth said, pointing to the scrying pool. "The Inquisition calls it an asset, but it does not serve their emperor. It serves a philosophy of absolute stasis. It seeks a galaxy where nothing grows, nothing rots, and nothing changes. It is the antithesis of everything we are." Mortarion leaned closer to the pool, his jaundiced eyes narrowing as he watched SCP-049 operate on the fallen Black Templar. He saw the precision, the lack of emotion, and the utter disregard for the warp's power. For a being like Mortarion, who had spent an eternity struggling with the balance between cold science and the numinous power of chaos, the Doctor was a fascinating mirror. "He is from elsewhere," Mortarion mused, the iron chains on his armor clinking. "A universe where the laws of biology were rigid, perhaps. He brings that rigidity here, like a needle being thrust into a soft, ripening fruit. The grandfather is displeased, Golgoth. This Doctor is an insult to the very concept of the Great Plague. He does not understand that disease is the ultimate freedom. Shall we send the Seventh Great Company to annihilate him?" Golgoth asked, his many needles twitching. "No," Mortarion replied, a cruel smile touching his thin lips. "To kill him is to waste a unique specimen. I wish to see him broken. I wish to see the look on that bird mask when he realizes that his cure is merely another form of death, one that is hollow and meaningless. We will not hunt him with blades. We will hunt him with a gift he cannot ignore." The Pale King turned away, his wings fluttering with a sound like dry parchment. "Ready the Life-Eater strains, but modify them. I want a plague that mimics his own sterile void, a disease that consumes the silence. Let us see how the surgeon fares when he is the one who is infected." Light years away, in the high-security labs of the inquisitorial moon base Sepulchre 4, SCP-049 was blissfully unaware of the eyes of a Primarch. He was currently standing before his latest achievement, Brother Arnulf of the Black Templars. The Marine was no longer the screaming, dying wreck he had been on the Black Ship. He was a silent sentinel of gray ceramite. 049 had spent days refining the Astartes 0492 process, integrating his own anomalous chemicals with the Space Marine's black carapace and multi-lung. "Walk," 049 commanded. The Black Templar stepped forward, his movements perfectly measured. There was no sound of labored breathing, no rhythmic thrum of a power pack. The Marine was a closed system, a biological machine that required neither food, nor sleep, nor prayer. "Your efficiency is remarkable," 049 said, checking the silver sutures in the Marine's neck. "You are the first patient who has truly survived the transition with your structural integrity fully intact. The Astartes frame is indeed a masterpiece of engineering, though it was designed for the wrong war. You were made to kill, now you are made to endure." Behind the observation glass, Inquisitor Vane watched with a mixture of awe and growing terror. Beside him, Interrogator Coles looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "He's doing it, Vane," Coles whispered. "He's creating an army of them. He's already requested 50 more critically wounded Marines from the Hospitallers. He says the pestilence is a wildfire, and he needs a firewall of cured soldiers to stop it. The High Lords would have my head for this, Vane said, his bionic eye whirring as it tracked the silent marine. Turning the Emperor's chosen into whatever those things are. But look at the reports from the Ocularis front. Everywhere the Doctor's cured squads are deployed, the Nurgle outbreaks vanish. The demons can't feed on them. The poxwalkers can't infect them. They are a void in the enemy's strategy. But they aren't human anymore, Coles countered. They don't speak. They don't fight for the Emperor. They fight because the Doctor told them to. Vane, we're replacing one kind of monster with another. The Imperium has always traded its humanity for survival, Coles, Vane replied coldly. We use lobotomized servitors to run our ships. We use half-mad psychers to guide our fleets. What is a silent marine compared to a world lost to the Great Plague? As long as he remains under our control, the Doctor is our salvation. At that moment, 049 looked up at the window. He didn't wave or acknowledge them, but the way his mask tilted suggested he had heard every word. He turned back to the silent Arnulf and reached into his bag, pulling out a small, glass vial filled with a shimmering, oily substance. They think I am their tool, 049 whispered to the Marine, his voice too low for the microphones to catch. They think I serve their Emperor, but they do not see what I see. Their faith is just another symptom, a hallucination born of a species that knows it is dying. They worship a corpse on a throne of gold, and wonder why the rot won't stop. He touched the vial to Arnulf's forehead. But you and I, we are different. We are the beginning of a sterile galaxy, a galaxy where the noise of the soul is finally hushed. And soon, brother, we shall begin the next phase. I have heard of a place called the Garden, a place where the pestilence is born. I think it is time we paid a visit to the source of the infection. A doctor must always go where the disease is strongest. Arnulf said nothing, but his gray eyes flickered with a dim, artificial light. Somewhere in the warp, the bells of Nurgle told a warning, but in the sterile silence of Sepulchre 4, the only sound was the cold, clinical click of a scalpel being sharpened. Gnosis Prime was a world that had forgotten the color of a sunset. It was a forge world of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a planet-sized machine where the sky was a permanent bruise of smog, and the soil had long ago been replaced by layers of brass plating and data conduits. In the heart of its primary manufactorum spire, the Inquisition had established the sanctum of clinical perfection for SCP-049. Here, the sterile silence the Doctor craved was maintained by a legion of tech priests who viewed his work not as medical miracle, but as a fascinating optimization of the biological machine. To the cultists of Mars, the flesh was weak, but the Doctor had found a way to make it consistent. 049 stood at the center of a circular operating theater, illuminated by a halo of surgical lumens that hummed with a low-frequency psychic dampener. Around him stood his Angels of Silence, a dozen Astartes 0492 instances, their black ceramite armor polished to a dull, funereal sheen. They did not move, did not breathe, and did not dream. They were his assistants, his bodyguards, and his most successful case studies. "The patient is ready, Doctor," a voice crackled through a vox emitter. Archmagos Kotov of the Adeptus Mechanicus was lowered into the pit on a series of hydraulic gantry arms. Kotov was more machine than man. His lower body was a multi-legged brass carriage, and his torso was a forest of mechadendrites and glowing ocular sensors. Only a small portion of his face remained biological, a patch of pale, wrinkled skin around a single wet eye. He was not sick in the traditional sense, but in the 41st millennium, health was a relative term. "Archmagos," 049 said, nodding politely as he selected a heavy, diamond-tipped bone drill from his bag. "I understand you have been experiencing inefficiencies in your neural biological interface. The flesh protests," Kotov droned in a staccato binary cant that 049's mind translated with eerie ease. "The residual biological components introduce noise into the logic stream. The warp, it whispers through the marrow, 'I seek the purity of the machine, but the organic core remains a vector for corruption. I wish to be optimized.' You seek to be cured," 049 corrected, his voice a soft, melodic contrast to the grinding gears of the forge. "Your Mechanicus replaces the limb, but they leave the soul. And it is the soul that carries the pestilence, Archmagos. It is the ghost in your machine that invites the rot. If we are to achieve true perfection, we must address the root of the noise. Behind the observation shield, Inquisitor Vane watched with his bionic eye narrowed. He was beginning to look haggard. The strain of managing an anomaly that was effectively rewriting Imperial doctrine was taking its toll. Beside him stood a high-ranking official of the Administratum, a man named Baron Hesk, whose face was a mask of aristocratic terror. "You're letting that creature operate on an archmagos of the Trinity?" Hesk hissed, clutching his velvet robes. "This is tech heresy. This is a violation of the Treaty of Mars." "It is a necessity," Vane replied, his voice cold. Kotov volunteered. He saw what the Doctor did to the Death Guard. He knows that if the Plague Wars reach this sector, even the machine gods chosen will melt into sludge. He wants to be immune, and I want to see if the Doctor's process can be applied to the ruling elite. Imagine, Baron, an administratum that never tires, a high command that cannot be corrupted by the whispers of the dark gods, a silent, perfect bureaucracy. "It sounds like a graveyard," Hesk whispered. "It sounds like survival," Vane countered. In the pit below, the procedure began. 049 did not use anesthesia. To him, pain was merely a sensory overcalibration, a symptom to be ignored. As the drill bit into Kotov's remaining skull plate, the Archmagos' mechadendrites lashed out in a violent, instinctive spasm. 049 didn't even look up. One of his silent Astartes stepped forward and pinned the brass limbs to the table with a strength that made the metal groan. "Be still," 049 murmured. "The noise is loudest just before it ceases." The Doctor's hands moved with a terrifying, non-human fluidity. He was not just performing surgery, he was performing an exorcism of the biological imperative. He reached into the open cavity of Kotov's chest, where a wet, laboring heart sat amidst a nest of glowing wires. With a single, precise snip of a silver scalpel, he severed the primary aorta. The heart stopped. The monitors flatlined. The binary cant died in Kotov's throat. "Biological cessation achieved," 049 announced to the room. He then reached into his bag and pulled out a series of vials containing a viscous, iridescent gray fluid, the distilled essence of the Pestilence Zero strain he had been developing since his arrival. He began injecting it directly into Kotov's nervous system, tracing the paths of the silver thread he had woven into the Archmagos' brain. "Now," 049 whispered, "we introduce the anchor." For 3 hours, the Doctor worked, his robes becoming stained with a mixture of black oil and pale synthetic blood. He replaced the organic soul resonance with a cold, hollow vacuum. He stitched the remaining flesh with a geometry that defied imperial medical science, patterns that seemed to pull at the eyes of those who watched. As the final stitch was pulled tight, 049 stepped back. He did not use a jumper cable or a battery. He simply leaned down and whispered a single, ancient word into the Archmagos' auditory sensor. Kotov's brass legs twitched. His mechadendrites rose slowly, like the legs of a waking spider. His single ocular sensor flickered to life, but instead of the warm red glow of the Mechanicus, it burned with a flat, clinical white. "Status report," the Archmagos droned. The voice was no longer a staccato of binary, it was a smooth, melodic resonance that perfectly matched the Doctor's own tone. "The noise?" 049 asked. "Silent," Shalotov replied. "The whispers have ceased. The great pestilence has been evicted. I see the logic of the stars now, Doctor. It is very clean." A wave of unease swept through the observation deck. Baron Hesk fainted, his body hitting the floor with a soft thud. Even Vane took a step back, his hand instinctively moving to the rosette at his hip. He had wanted a weapon, but he realized now that he was watching the birth of a new species. "He's not a tech priest anymore," Vane whispered. "He's a herald." 049 looked up at the glass. He could see the fear in Vane's eyes, and for the first time, the Doctor felt something akin to triumph. On his world, he had been a prisoner of the Foundation, a freak to be contained. Here, he was a king of a new order. The Imperium was a vast, rotting hospital, and he had finally been given the authority to clear the wards. "Inquisitor!" 049's voice carried through the Vox system, sounding more authoritative than ever. "The Archmagos is cured. His manufactorums can now be converted to produce the necessary medical supplies for our larger campaign. We shall begin with the cleansing of the neighboring subsectors. I have identified several planetary governors who are showing early symptoms of the soul rot." Symptoms? Vane asked, his voice trembling. What symptoms? They haven't reported any plague. They exist in a universe of chaos, 049 replied, tilting his mask. That is the only symptom I require. Prevention, as they say, is the best medicine, and I intend to be very preventative. As 049 turned back to his silent, gray-skinned army, the lights of Gnosis Prime flickered. Across the planet, the binary cant of millions of tech priests began to shift, their rhythmic chanting falling into sync with the doctor's heartbeat. The warp storms at the edge of the system seemed to recoil, the screaming daemons sensing a new kind of death approaching, not the hot, messy death of fire and blood, but the cold, silent death of the scalpel. The doctor was no longer just an asset, he was a pandemic of order, and the galaxy was finally, mercifully, beginning to go quiet. The orbital defense grid of Gnosis Prime did not fail due to a lack of power or a flaw in its ancient cogitators. It failed because it began to weep. The massive lance batteries, capable of cracking the crust of a moon, suddenly softened into a substance resembling wet clay. The servitors hardwired into the targeting systems began to scream, their lobotomized brains suddenly flooded with the sensation of a billion flies hatching beneath their eyelids. From the boiling warp storms at the system's edge, the fleet of the Death Guard emerged, not as a cohesive naval force, but as a drifting, necrotic infection of the void. At its heart was the Endurance, the flagship of Mortarion, its shadow falling across the Forge world like a shroud of black mold. Down in the sanctum of clinical perfection, SCP-049 did not look at the tactical hollows or the frantic red alert icons flashing across the screens. He was busy adjusting the cervical sutures on a new batch of silent initiates. Around him, the air in the sanctum remained crisp and sterile, a sharp contrast to the sulphurous gloom of the planet outside. "Doctor," the voice of Archmagos Kotov echoed through the chamber, his brass legs clicking rhythmically. "The sensors indicate a massive biological incursion. The enemy possesses a signature that mimics our own void frequency, yet it is distorted. It is a mimicry of the cure used as a vector for infection." 049 paused, his hand hovering over a tray of silver scalpels. He tilted his head, listening. The low hum of the sanctum's dampeners was being undercut by a new sound, a rhythmic, deep-toned tolling that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the bone. It was the bell of toxins, a relic of the 14th Legion, and every strike carried a century of stagnant suffering. "Mortarion?" 049 murmured, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He is a stubborn patient. He refuses to accept that his time has passed. He wishes to preserve the fever rather than heal the body." "The Inquisitor has fled," Kotov reported, his white burning eye flickering. "Lord Vane has ordered the withdrawal of all non-optimized forces. He intends to initiate a scorched earth protocol from orbit if the sanctum falls. He views us as a lost investment." "Vane was always a man of limited vision," 049 replied, stepping toward the center of the hall. He looked at his silent army, over 300 Astartes 049-2, and thousands of cured tech priests. "He thinks in terms of territory. I think in terms of eradication. Open the primary bulkhead. Let the infection come to the clinic. It is time we showed the great pestilence that even a god can be dissected." The bulkhead hissed open, and the atmosphere of Gnosis Prime rushed in, a hot, wet wind carrying the smell of a million open graves. Through the fog stepped the Death Guard. They did not charge. They marched with a slow, inevitable momentum, their boots crunching on the sterile floor. Leading them was Golgoth the Untidy, his many surgical arms whirring with rusted blades. "The Pale King sends a gift," Golgoth bellowed, his voice a wet rattle. "The grandfather found your silence boring. He has brewed something to make you scream." The Plague Marines raised their blight launchers and fired. But instead of exploding in a shower of corrosive gas, the canisters cracked open to release a shimmering gray-green vapor. It was Mortarion's modified strain, a plague designed to target the anchor serum that held 049's thralls together. As the vapor touched the silent Astartes, the effect was horrific. They did not rot in the traditional sense. Instead, the silver threads stitching their souls to the void began to fray. The silent warriors began to twitch. Their gray skin bubbled with a dry, papery growth. They did not scream, they had no lungs to do so, but the mechanical precision of their movements vanished. They became a stuttering, broken chorus of gray meat and rusted ceramite. 049 watched, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying rage. Such sloppiness. To take a masterpiece of stasis and introduce randomness? It is a professional insult of the highest order. He stepped forward, his black robes billowing. He did not use a gun. He did not use a sword. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a pair of glass spheres filled with a pitch-black liquid, his final solution strain, synthesized from the very heart of the warp-nullifying properties he had discovered. He smashed them at his feet. A shockwave of absolute silence rippled outward. Where the gray-green vapor touched it, the mist simply ceased to exist. It didn't dissipate. It was deleted from reality. The Plague Marines who were caught in the radius of the Black Cure stopped in their tracks. Their armor, fused to their bodies for 10 millennia, suddenly became inert. The daemons inhabiting their flesh were snuffed out like candles in a vacuum. They collapsed into piles of ancient, brittle bone and dry dust. "You speak of gifts?" 049 asked, walking through the cloud of ash he had created. "You are nothing but a collection of symptoms clinging to a dead dream. Your grandfather is a parasite, and I am the immune system of the universe." He reached Golgoth. The plague surgeon tried to raise a rusted cleaver, but 049 was faster. He caught Golgoth's wrist, and the doctor's lethal touch bypassed the Marine's bloated defenses. The rot in Golgoth's arm didn't just stop. It was reversed with such violent force that the flesh turned to sterile glass and then shattered. "I shall keep you alive, I think," 049 whispered, pressing a long, thin needle into Golgoth's throat. "I have never performed an autopsy on a creature that is already 90% necrotic. It will be an enlightening consultation." As 049 began to cure the plague surgeon in the middle of the battlefield, the sanctum became a charnel house of clinical horror. The silent thralls, even as they crumbled under Mortarian's plague, fought with a suicidal, cold efficiency, tearing into the death guard with bare hands and surgical tools. High above, in the Endurance, Mortarian watched the feed from Golgoth's remaining ocular lens. He saw the doctor standing over his fallen son, the bird-masked figure looking less like a man and more like a predatory god of the void. He saw his modified plague being neutralized, not by faith or fire, but by a superior, more absolute form of death. "He is not a man," Mortarian whispered, his hand tightening on the haft of silence. "He is a void pathogen. He is the thing that comes when the fire of life goes out and the rot is done. He is the end of the cycle." Mortarian felt something he hadn't felt since he stood before the Emperor of Mankind. A cold, sharp spike of genuine uncertainty. This creature was not of the warp, and it was not of the materium. It was a third thing, a clinical absolute that threatened to turn the great game of the gods into a silent, empty board. "Bring the ship into the atmosphere," Mortarian commanded, his wings flaring with a dark, oily light. "I will not let this creature steal the grandfather's harvest. If Gnosis Prime must be silenced, it will be silenced by my hand." Below, amidst the screaming and the ash, SCP-049 looked up at the darkening sky. He saw the massive flagship descending, its hull glowing with the heat of re-entry. He felt the pestilence radiating from the Daemon Primarch like a sun of filth. He adjusted his gloves and picked up a fresh bone saw. "Excellent," 049 said to the dying Golgoth. "The chief resident has arrived. Prepare the theater. This will be the most significant procedure in the history of this wretched galaxy." The sky above Gnosis Prime did not merely darken. It bruised, then burst like an overripe fruit. The Endurance descended through the clouds, its massive, barnacle-encrusted hull screaming against the atmosphere. It did not land so much as it collided with reality, its arrival punctuated by the tolling of a bell that vibrated through the very bedrock of the planet. As the flagship's shadow enveloped the sanctum of clinical perfection, the air became so thick with the blessings of Nurgle that the sterile atmospheric scrubbers of the Forge world groaned and caught fire, vomiting black, oily smoke. From the heart of the wreckage, trailing a cloak of tattered moth wings and the stench of a billion rotting civilizations, stepped Mortarian. He was a mountain of gaunt, hateful majesty. His breathing was a wet, mechanical wheeze filtered through a brass and lead apparatus, and in his right hand he gripped Silence, the great scythe that had reaped the lives of heroes for 10,000 years. Around him, the ground liquefied into a foul-smelling mire. The silent tech priests, who stood in his path, did not merely die. They dissolved, their silver-stitched souls, unable to hold their forms against the raw, concentrated presence of the Daemon Primarch. SCP-049 stood at the center of the ruins of his laboratory, his black robes fluttering in the putrid wind. He was alone. His army of cured Astartes had been reduced to heaps of inert ceramite by the sheer psychic pressure of Mortarian's descent. Yet the doctor did not tremble. He did not reach for a weapon. He stood with his medical bag clutched in a white-knuckled grip, his mask tilted upward as if observing a particularly fascinating, if grotesque, tumor. "You!" Mortarian rasped, the sound like dry bone grinding on glass. "The little surgeon who thinks he can cut the grandfather's garden out of the galaxy. I have seen your work, creature. It is a desert. It is a graveyard of the spirit. You do not heal. You delete. You are a void-born blasphemy." "And you," 049 replied, his voice a steady, crystalline bell in the cacophony of the storm. "You are the apex of the infection. You are a cancer that has convinced itself it is the body. I have seen many advanced cases, Mortarian, but you are a systemic failure given sentience. You are the very definition of the great pestilence." Mortarian let out a dry, rattling laugh. "I am the god of rot. I am the truth of the universe. All things must decay. All things must feed the cycle. Your silence is a lie." The Primarch swung silence in a massive, horizontal arc. 049 moved with a speed that defied the laws of the materium, his body blurring into a shadow as he ducked beneath the rusted blade. He didn't retreat. He lunged forward, his gloved hand reaching for the exposed, pale skin of Mortarian's neck. The doctor's palm met the Daemon Primarch's hide. For the first time in an eternity, Mortarian felt a sensation that was not pain, but its opposite, a total, absolute lack of feeling. Where 049 touched him, the warp fires that fueled his demonic form were snuffed out. The green, glowing ichor in his veins turned to cold gray ash. Mortarian recoiled, a look of genuine shock crossing his gaunt features. He struck out with a backhand, his massive armored fist catching 049 in the chest and throwing him through a reinforced adamantium bulkhead. 049 hit the floor, his mask cracking slightly, but he stood up instantly, ignoring the splintered ribs. "A crude response," the doctor noted, coughing up a spray of dark, viscous fluid. "But expected. The patient always resists the most necessary procedures." "I am a god of the Empyrean," Mortarian roared, his wings flaring with an oily purple light. "You cannot cure what is eternal." "Eternal?" 049 asked, walking back toward him. "Nothing is eternal in the face of a total biological cessation. You are sustained by a rift, Mortarian, a wound in the fabric of this dimension. You are the pus weeping from an uncleaned sore. To cure you, I must first close the wound." The doctor turned his attention to the primary warp gate of Gnosis Prime, a massive ringed structure of brass and obsidian that the Death Guard had hijacked to bridge the gap between the Materium and the Garden of Nurgle. It was hemorrhaging raw chaos energy, a swirling vortex of green and purple that threatened to swallow the planet. "Kotov!" 049 shouted, his voice amplified by the strange, hollow resonance of the sanctum. From the shadows, the cured Archmagos Kotov emerged, his brass legs dragging, his ocular sensor burning with a sterile white light. He was carrying the Black Cure, the final concentrated strain of the doctor's void toxin, housed in a massive lead-lined canister. "The delivery system is prepared." "Doctor," Kotov droned. Mortarian saw the threat. He realized that 049 wasn't trying to kill him in a duel. He was trying to perform surgery on reality itself. The Primarch lunged for the canister, but he was intercepted by a dozen of 049's remaining silent Astartes. They threw themselves onto his massive frame, their gray hands clutching at his wings, their cold, inert bodies absorbing the warp energies he radiated. They were like lead blankets thrown onto a nuclear reactor. "Get off me, you soulless husks!" Mortarian screamed, tearing them apart with his bare hands. But for every one he crushed, another took its place. They were not fighting for the Emperor, they were fighting for the surgeon. 049 reached the warp gate. He did not use a bomb. He pulled out a long, curved needle of silver and a thread of pure, pulverized null circuitry. He began to stitch the air. He moved around the circumference of the rift, his hands dancing through the swirling madness of the warp. Every time his needle pierced the veil, the green light flickered and died. He was sewing the materium back together, using his own anomalous essence as the anchor. The warp energy lashed out at him. burning his robes, melting the leather of his gloves, but he did not stop. "It is a simple closure," 049 whispered, his voice becoming a melodic chant. "The edges must be debrided. The edges must be aligned. The infection must be contained." Mortarion broke free of the Astartes, his face a mask of fury. He raised Silence for a final killing blow, but as he stepped toward the doctor, the warp gate began to collapse. The link to the Garden of Nurgle was being severed. The pestilence that sustained Mortarion was being sucked back into the void. The Primarch's massive form began to flicker. He became translucent, his wings dissolving into gray ash. "This is not over," he wheezed, his voice fading into the howling wind of the closing rift. "The grandfather will not forget." With a final violent pop, the warp gate collapsed into a single sterile point of light and then vanished. Mortarion was gone, pulled back into the Empyrean as his tether was cut. The silence that followed was absolute. The bells had stopped. The flies were dead. Gnosis Prime was no longer a battlefield. It was a vacuum. SCP-049 stood before the now empty arch of the gate. His robes were rags. His mask was shattered, revealing a glimpse of pale, ancient skin and an eye that had seen the end of worlds. He leaned against the cold brass of the gate, his hand trembling as he stowed his needle. "The procedure is complete," he whispered. He looked around the laboratory. Kotov was still there, standing motionless. The silent Astartes were piles of junk. The planet was saved from Nurgle, but at a terrible price. Every living thing on Gnosis Prime that hadn't been cured was dead, their souls snuffed out by the sheer, sterile void the Doctor had summoned to close the gate. "Doctor," Kotov droned, "the Inquisition fleet is entering the system. Lord Vane is calling for your surrender." 049 looked up at the gray, smog-choked sky. He could feel the eyes of the Imperium on him, the fear, the hatred, the pestilence of their desperate, clinging faith. "Surrender?" 049 asked, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I have just saved their world. And yet, I see they are already showing symptoms of a relapse. The great pestilence is so very persistent." He picked up his bag and turned toward the shadows of the Forge World's deeper levels. "Well then, we shall have to prepare for the next consultation. A doctor's work, it seems, is never truly finished." Gnosis Prime did not ring with the sound of hammers, nor did it pulse with the frantic chanting of binary cant. It hummed with the sound of a dead lung, a low, mechanical vibration that was the only remnant of the planet's former life. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, a suffocating blanket of sterile air that seemed to press against the eardrums of anyone who ventured onto the surface. When the first inquisitorial Valkyries descended from the vengeance of Saint Capelline, their thrusters sounded like a scream in a tomb. Inquisitor Vane stepped onto the landing pad, his bionic eye whirring in a frantic attempt to find a single spark of biological warmth. He found nothing. The dead of Gnosis Prime were not like the dead of any other battlefield in the 41st millennium. There were no piles of rotting corpses, no charred remains, no twisted limbs frozen in the agony of a bolt round's impact. The citizens, the millions of laborers and servitors who had not been cured before the warp gate collapsed, stood or lay exactly where they had been when the void shockwave hit. They looked like wax figures, their skin a pale, uniform gray, their eyes open and clear, yet devoid of the light of the soul. It was as if someone had reached into the world and simply turned off the electricity of their existence. "The doctor," Vane whispered, his voice trembling as he walked through the ranks of the perfected dead. "He didn't just stop the plague, he stopped everything." "Lord Inquisitor, we have a signal," Interrogator Coles said, his hand shaking as he pointed toward the ruins of the Sanctum of Clinical Perfection. "It's coming from the sublevels, a rhythmic pulse. It's the doctor's heartbeat." Vane led a squad of Grey Knights into the depths. The silver-clad giants, usually the most resolute warriors in the Imperium, moved with a strange, hesitant caution. They felt the vacuum 049 had created, a psychic null zone that was more absolute than anything a Sister of Silence could project. It wasn't a lack of the warp, it was a denial of it. In the center of the shattered laboratory, SCP-049 sat on a crate of medical supplies. He was stitching a piece of leather back onto his glove. His mask was still cracked, revealing a face that looked less like a monster and more like a scholar who had spent 1,000 years in a library without windows. Surrounding him were his nurses, a dozen Astartes 0492, and the Archmagos Kotov, all standing in a perfect, unmoving circle. "You are late for the post-operative review, Lord Vane," 049 said without looking up. His voice had lost its melodic warmth. It was now as cold and sharp as the scalpels he carried. "The patient, Gnosis Prime, has been stabilized. The acute infection has been excised." "You murdered a world," Vane hissed, leveling his bolt pistol at the doctor. "You were meant to be a weapon against the archenemy, not a replacement for it. Every soul on this planet is gone. The Administratum will label this a tragedy of the highest order." 049 looked up then, and Vane felt a sudden crushing weight in his chest. It wasn't psychic power, it was the sheer clinical certainty in the doctor's eyes. "Soul?" 049 asked, tilting his head. "You speak of the soul as if it were a vital organ. It is not. It is a defect. It is the very thing that the pestilence attaches to. Without it, your species is durable. Without it, you are immune to the whispers of the dark gods and the rot of the physical realm. I have not murdered Gnosis Prime. I have archived it. I have preserved it in a state where the warp can never touch it again." "Arrest him!" Vane shouted to the Grey Knights. "By the authority of the Golden Throne, take him into custody." The Grey Knights stepped forward, but they stopped as the silent Astartes around 049 moved with a synchronized, terrifying fluidity. They didn't draw weapons, they simply stood in the way, their gray eyes staring into the silver visors of the Emperor's finest. "Do not bother," 049 said, standing up and picking up his bag. "I am no longer your asset, Lord Vane. I have seen the true nature of your Imperium. It is a hospice, where the dying argue over the color of their shrouds. You do not want a cure. You want a longer, more painful death. You worship the very symptoms that are killing you." 049 walked toward the shadows of the deeper tunnels, his silent army parting to let him through. "I have heard of other worlds. Worlds where the pestilence is even more entrenched. Terra, Baal, Ultramar. The infection is vast, but I am a very patient physician." "You won't leave this planet alive!" Vane screamed, firing his bolt pistol. The round struck 049 in the back, but there was no explosion of gore. The shell buried itself in the doctor's heavy robes and simply stopped, its kinetic energy neutralized by the strange, sterile field he projected. 049 didn't even flinch. He continued walking into the dark, his form becoming a shadow among shadows. "The great pestilence is the soul of humanity itself," 049's voice echoed from the tunnels, sounding as if it were coming from every direction at once. "And I shall not rest until every ward is silent. Until every fever is broken. The 41st millennium is a very sick time, Inquisitor, but the Doctor is finally, truly, in." When the Grey Knights finally charged into the sublevels, they found nothing. SCP-049, Archmagos Kotov, and the Silent Marines had vanished into the labyrinthine depths of the Forge World. They didn't leave through the atmosphere. They simply seemed to have become part of the planet's new, sterile architecture. In the months that followed, Gnosis Prime was declared excommunicatus extremis, but not for the reasons most worlds were. It was not a world of demons or heretics. It was a world of absolute, unmoving order. It became a legend among the underhives of the Segmentum, a story of the Pale Saint, who could take away the pain, the fear, and the rot, leaving only a perfect, dreamless silence. The Inquisition tried to bury the records, but the cure had already begun to spread. In the dark corners of 1,000 hive worlds, men and women began to find small, silver needles and leather-bound journals written in a language that defied translation. They began to hear a rhythmic, melodic humming in the shadows. And when the plagues of Nurgle came, they didn't pray to the Emperor, they waited for the Doctor. Across the galaxy, the bells of Nurgle continued to toll, but for the first time in 10,000 years, they were answered by a chilling, clinical silence. The war for the soul of humanity had a new player, one who didn't want to win the war, but to cancel it entirely. Conclusion: the arrival of SCP-049 into the Warhammer 40K universe fundamentally shifts the balance of the eternal war between the Imperium and Chaos. While the Inquisition initially sought to weaponize the Doctor against the plagues of Nurgle, they failed to realize that 049's cure is as much a threat to humanity as the disease it treats. By removing the soul resonance that the warp exploits, the Doctor creates a third path for sentient life, a state of absolute biological and spiritual stasis. Gnosis Prime stands as a chilling testament to this new reality, a world that is saved, yet entirely empty of the passion, faith, and struggle that define the human experience. As 049 vanishes into the shadows of the Imperium, he becomes a viral myth, a saint of the void, whose influence grows in the dark. The Death Guard and the forces of Nurgle now face an enemy they cannot corrupt, while the Imperium faces a savior who demands a price they cannot pay. In a galaxy defined by the roar of battle and the screams of the damned, the Doctor brings a terror far more absolute, the promise that one day, finally, the screaming will stop.